So without further ado, then I'll hand over to you, Zoe, to talk about democratization by researcher, not of researcher. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Privileged to be here. Excited to talk to you all today about what's really important to me, which is that this is a process that we are leading, that we are driving. Please do drop comments in the chat. We will kind of address them likely at the end, but perhaps as we go, depending on timing. So let's start here. One of our favorite things in talks. What are we going to talk about? And then let's talk about it. So I want to talk about a couple of things that people say are wrong with democratization and how we can really kind of better address that. And then what I'm calling our 4 commitments. So democratization is not something that happens passively. It is something that requires a ton of intention and work. And I have boiled those down to what I think are the most important 4 pieces to make that work. And that is your commitment to research, your commitment to your team's growth, commitment to boundaries. Anybody who came to the panel this morning knows I love a good boundary, and commitment to support both of your team and of people doing that research. So with that, let's dive in. What are those core arguments? We hear about these all the time online, and I think one of the biggest one is UX research is hard, and it is hard, and therefore non-researchers can't do it. And we have these great quotes that come out all the time that say things like, I've never gone up to a developer, asked them to train me in one day, and believed I could do their job, right? And we even think this about all sorts of other careers, and we make all sorts of allusions there. Like, I wouldn't want my brain surgeon to be democratized. And I think those are fair points. And we come at it from research in the same way. We worked really hard at this. Discovering nuance, discovering layers of research is not easy. So how can we expect some random person who doesn't have that training to do that? And the second is that democratization cheapens UXR and also has the potential to reduce headcount, right? If anyone can do research, well, why have researchers? We could get layoffs are obviously a big thing right now. We could continue to shrink those headcount down and expect that job function to be met in other ways, which leads us to quotes like this one: democratization treats research as a skill, not a profession. When are other disciplines like design, product, or engineering under the same pressure to democratize? And I think these are fair points, right? These are things that we can think about. But ultimately, they come to this idea that we have lost control. Right? It's not ours anymore. Somebody else owns it. Somebody else is deciding what happens to research, when research is used, and when it is supported, versus us having that power to say this is appropriate or inappropriate. And it leads us to things like these memes that I found online last week that says, if my house was on fire, I would choose professional firefighters over democratized firefighters every single time. And I actually really love this meme for a couple of reasons. One, I think it proves the argument for democratization brilliantly. On the left, we have a huge apartment fire with multiple units and a trained group where every single person needs specific and high levels of training to figure out how to take that big project down. And that is the best use for your researchers. Similarly, if you have a campfire, you're not going to call your firefighter, right? They've got other things, more important things that they need to be focusing on. And with the appropriate guidance and support, right, they're very well organized. They're passing those buckets efficiently. That water is coming from somewhere. You can put out that campfire. So how do we start to think about this less as something that happens to research, democratization, and we are a victim of it, and something that we own and empower and can push forward? Therefore, we're not victim to this. We lead it, and it is by researcher, not of research. This is the big reframe I'm hoping to push on you today. Now, a big piece of this is it's got to be cautious and it's got to be conscious. I think one of the big fears, and this has happened at various companies, where we just say, we're democratizing research, we're buying some product, fill in the blank of all the great products available today. We're going to give our designers and product people access to it, and we're going to step away. And that is not proper democratization. Proper democratization still has boundaries, still has support, still has great research behind it. And the best way to do that is to focus on both what we're putting into the equation and what's coming out of it. So what do I mean by things coming into the equation? These are things like having great researchers that can help guide this process. And what's coming out of it is any of those outputs, any of that data, those findings that are democratized, that we still make sure that it is valid, that it was collected in a way that makes sense, that reduces the risk of that data being misused and leveraged the way it should be leveraged, right? They're not taking a usability study with an N of 6 and using that to completely decide product direction of a very large established product. Cautious and conscious throughout. And I love this quote by Olivia Butler. What we don't see, we assume can't be. What a destructive assumption. Right now, I think we are in this space where we haven't seen a lot of healthy democratization at scale, or we're hearing about it because of all these companies' NDAs and things. We're not actually seeing how it's coming to light. And I want to push on you that just because we haven't seen it before, it doesn't mean it can't be. It's destructive to think so. We can actually build something pretty darn amazing together. Now, to come to those 4 commitments, so how do we control these inputs? How do we control those outputs to make sure that this is healthy and safe? The first one is commitment to researchers. Put your own oxygen mask on before attempting to help those around you. Your team, your researchers, you as a researcher deserve safety, deserve support, deserve respect within your organization. And you can't jump into democratization until you've made sure that you have that. Democratization really is one of the final steps of mature research practice. It's not the first step and shouldn't be the foundation of research. Now, this is not to say that maybe that early stage startup who never had research before and was collecting data did something wrong. It's just that when we're truly thinking about these as intentional systems, it's not the first thing out of the gate. Now, what is the first thing out of the gate? What do you say, hey, I'm healthy enough, I'm supportive enough that I know I can democratize right now? A big piece is that research has a seat at the table, right? That means up there with product, up there with design, up there with engineering, this user-centric view gets to say, yeah, this is where we're supposed to be. This is how we influence product. And people know to look to research as a clear partner in making those decisions. This also involves metrics for success, right? Your researchers need to be successful. They need to get into their performance review or whatever your community's equivalent is and say, I did this well. I'm doing my job well, and they can rely on that. So what does your company define as success should be really clear. There should be clear headcount. Researchers are needed. They needed to guide this process, to give it boundaries, to give it guardrails, and making sure that you have the headcount now and into the future to support this work, that it's not expected to be totally self-sustaining, is an imperative part of this. And finally, a path for growth for the individual. What does it mean to go from a 3 to a 4 to a 5 or whatever leveling you use such that you can become more senior, that you can take on more responsibility, can take on more complex interactions between users? What does that mean for your company, and how are you making sure that democratization is a part of that path and supports that path? And you aren't leaving it up for researchers to kind of decide at will, leaving them without the stability they need to grow properly. Everyone in your organization should be able to say, we're confident in our role in this organization now and 10 years from now. There will be a job for me. There will be something awesome and cool and exciting for me to do to drive this forward. And not only does democratization not hurt that, it helps empower that. If you're not there yet, take a quick step back. Now, just as we think about garbage in, garbage out all the time, we talk about this a lot as researchers with methods, right? Don't use the wrong one, don't use not enough people. But it also applies to the other facets of democratization, right? There's proper support for it. There is organization. There is follow through. That's what we want. We want to make sure it's good going in. It'll be good coming out. Support for your researchers and your participants equals support for your product. Similarly for growth, and of course for democratization, right? This is an intentional process. Garbage in, garbage out. If we're not specific with that, we're putting ourselves at bigger risk. Now, commitment to team growth. One of the big things we hear all the time, and I have a lot of empathy for this because especially right now, entry-level positions, junior positions are really hard to come by. Are there workarounds like contract rules? Sure. But even those, there's not a lot of them. And a lot of companies don't effectively know how to leverage their junior researchers or to create space for their junior researchers. So again, what I'm pushing on, you've got to have that path for growth, that path for support external to this democratization. And we hear this a lot. If there's so few junior positions, why are we filling them without researchers? Totally understand what this is coming from, but democratization is not the same as junior researcher. At least it shouldn't be. Definitely push on your organization if that's starting to emerge. Democratization should never replace researchers. It should empower them to expand their scope into more meaty, more interesting questions, or simply to take on more. Now, right now we're in this stage. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. This is all of our favorite yogi of all time, the one and only Yoda. A lot of organizations now, you're seeing this big delta between leadership's excitement for democratization and people on the ground's willingness and excitement for democratization. And if what you're seeing in your organization is that leaders are stoked and the people doing the research are saying, this is a terrible idea, I hate everything about it, chances are they're in that fear stage. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for research? They're not seeing the support they need. So make sure that you're setting people up to not be afraid, to feel empowered, to feel safe in their positions as they move through. Now, this is another piece of that. Junior research, absolutely not the same thing as democratization. Sure, there is overlap. Will junior researchers do a ton of usability testing? Yes. Will democratization likely do a bunch of usability testing? For sure. But also remember that 5 years ago, designers were by default expected to do usability testing. We're seeing an ebb and flow of these interactions over time. Now, how do these differ? In a ton of ways. What's the breadth of that topic? There was a great question in the panel this morning where someone said, well, what do you do when you have all of this democratized research points, but it's not brought together? That's a great opportunity for a junior researcher to start to do horizontal analyses and where those themes are coming in that you wouldn't expect from democratization. Your specific goals might vary. Democratization is often quite limited. I'm trying to figure out or understand this one question. A junior researcher is going to start to expand that out broader and also might have goals extrinsic to that research. Things like generating increased empathy, generating user connection, helping understand what the roadmap should be for the next year. There's a lot more to it than those specific questions that you might be addressing with democratization. Now, these are also things, of course, like depth, how horizontal it is, and even how the research is applied. Right? Is it limited in scope? Again, with those boundaries we'll talk about in a second. Or is it huge and anyone can do anything? Lots of opportunities going either way there. And finally, one of the big ones that we don't talk about enough, I think, is business responsibility. What is the outcome you're expecting from that individual? Very different from somebody doing democratized research versus the UXR. And again, going back, do you have a clear pathway for growth and expectations for individuals on both sides? Now, what does it mean to have commitment to your UXRs to enable their practice? I think it's 4 key things. 1, a really reliable research ladder. I think all sorts of different companies are working on these now. Everyone has different versions of it, and they change all the time. But it's a living document that says, this is the difference between a 3, a 4, and a 5, and so on and so forth. This is what it means to be a very high-level IC. This is what it means to be a high-level manager. But there's a clear understanding that this is what it means to be getting better and to move past the kind of research that you might even worry overlaps with democratization. Within that, you should also have a clear definition of impact. This is what it means to do great work. This is what it means to do meh work. This is how we help get you to that great work. So you're not guessing, oh, I spent 100 hours on this. I don't know if it's actually worthwhile. Your company is committed to what it means to do great work. There should also be clear and dedicated training. I actually think this is something much broader than this democratization question that we struggle with as an industry, is how do we support people in moving up? A lot of this right now is still very passive. Researchers kind of love that passive. Often we love to learn from others and adapt and take piecemeal of what we want and what we want in our own practice. But a company should have some clear guidelines of like, this is what it means to do quality usability. This is what it means to do a survey that's worth sending out. Really make sure you have those tools that enable people to grow. And finally, good, or I would even say great managers. Your managers enable all of this. So really checking in and making sure that not only are they providing things like career growth, but also that they can help take on new skills, take on new responsibility, and help understand the impact of the work that's happening. Without these, I would hearken to say that democratization will likely fail within your organization simply because of the varying interests between the researchers and those that are using that democratization. Now, commitment to boundaries. Democratization is not appropriate for everything. I know we've all talked about this, but we can't do everything, and we certainly can't do everything at once. Democratization takes time to establish, to build, to create something that is sustainable and long-running. What does it require? Training, support, and a clarity of goal. This is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it, and I'm confident that we have the skill and support to do it, and not defaulting to democratization simply because we're not doing something else. So if you're looking at your whole research roadmap and someone comes to you and says, I really want to do ABC, and you're like, oh, okay, well, relative to everything, that's actually really low impact and low priority. And they say to you, great, well, let's democratize it. Well, maybe it has high enough impact, but in all likelihood, it probably doesn't. If it's not something that's worth your time, it's not worth your time to democratize it. So be specific in what gets this support, because it is still timing and support, right? Make sure the outcome is worth what you're putting into it and that you can actually follow through. And within that, honesty is always better than politeness. In setting those boundaries, in setting those expectations, make sure you're not just saying yes to things simply because you want to be the person that said yes and that feels good, and that it's a project that makes sense for you and your team. Now, how do I define democratization potential? We'll say this had a really cool animation that apparently didn't come through. How do we decide if we want to democratize something? The formula I've come up with in my head is skill plus support plus impact minus risk. Now, if this was to scale, you'd probably see that risk be a lot bigger, right? That can be all sorts of things. That can be risk of how this data will be used, risk of wasted time, risk of offending users, risk of burning through users, especially early in companies. If you only have 1,000 users, doing research with 500 of them, you can't talk to those people for a while without really annoying them. Is that how you want to burn that social capital with your users? Maybe, maybe not. But what is the risk within your organization of this going poorly in any number of ways? Making sure to always look at that. Skill is both the skill of the person doing the democratization and the team supporting them. So with your salespeople, maybe they have an amazing ability to talk to users. They're really, really personable. How do you have the support to make sure that they don't dip into sales versus research? Support. Does your researcher have enough time to do this? And does it help their career progression to do so? Does it make sense relative to their other work? And finally, the thing that we talk about all the time in UX, does it have impact? Do people actually want to run with this? Is there bandwidth to run with it? Does it have the potential to change or shape direction relative to where you are in the product cycle? Now, if this all nets out to a positive, it probably has high democratization potential, which does mean foundational work might be great for democratization. If it nets out in the negative or in that fear category, maybe not. Explore other opportunities to see if this is even the right thing to be studying right now. And with that, one of your best words as a researcher who is democratizing is no. And I put this in a heart for a reason. It's a compassionate no, right? No doesn't mean I reject you, I think you're bad. No means I think there's a better way to do this, or I think that there's something else that our company should be focusing on. So leaning into that compassionate no, always one of your superpowers. And your final superpower is always going to be the ability to unplug. And what do I mean by this? At any point in this democratization process, you could say, I've thought about it. This actually isn't the right thing to do. Now, what does that look like? It could be any number of things. Given the goal of this project, that request is no longer in scope. Hey, this started with usability. It's turning into something that's got a lot of foundational aspects, and I don't think we have the skill or support to do that right now. It can be pretty soft like that. You could also just say this method no longer makes sense, or we don't have the expertise or bandwidth. And it also could be something as severe as, for the safety of our users, we're unable to continue this project. Right? I don't think this is an appropriate use of their time. I don't think this is a risk we're willing to take because of the things we're asking them to do or the way we're interacting with them. And that could be psychological safety just as much as it could be physical. But always know that you have that ability to pull that. Which brings us to, a quote. Now, a boundary lends a sense of ownership. Knowing what I am to own and take responsibility for gives me freedom. Your team needs to know what they own and what they don't own and be able to really put that boundary down. And this brings us to our final commitment, the commitment to support. Now, commitment to support goes two ways. In green, we've got our non-researchers, and in pink, we've got our researchers. Commitment to researchers, we've talked about a couple of these, but it's things like formalizing trading, really setting up your UXRs for success in what is good democratization and making it intentional and consistent across your org. This work also needs to be rewarded. This is one of the big risks I hear with democratization is people lead this whole process and then they go, well, but I didn't do it, so I don't get credit. If you're expecting your researchers to democratize, value that work. If you are a researcher democratizing, make it clear that that work needs to be valued before you do it. And that should be things like that career ladder we talked about, really calling out that this is important and valuable work and reward it as they go through, right? Just because they didn't write the deck does not mean it didn't happen as a result of their work. And of course, enable that no. Your managers, your leaders need to be able to trust and rely on researchers to use that no judiciously and as they see fit. If your team says no, push on it. Now, for our non-researchers, our people who do research as we call them today, success should never be fuzzy. The greatest causes of anger are unclear expectations. This is when they think they're able to do something and they run with it, and then they run into that no. Try to avoid that. This is what it means to do this research. This is what it means to do it successfully. Often we refer to worksheets or templates to make this happen, but it's best if users can think for themselves within the confines of the project you've established. Now start with what they already know to make this happen, right? We don't expect auto mechanics to all of a sudden fly planes, but maybe they could start to work on that plane. Find where their skills are going to connect across. Think about things that they are already interested in. For your designers, think sculpture, not calculus. Focus on the goal, not the project or the ask. Often we fall into this where we forget why we're doing the thing we're doing. Always bring it back to that why of what we're doing. And of course, make it fun and empathetic. You might get through this entire process one time and the project failed. You didn't get the data you wanted, but your teammates now have an amazing amount of empathy and concern for both what researcher does and the user themselves. So that's still a win. Now, there are a couple of training necessities within support that I think are imperative. This list is not all of them, but most of them. And I don't think this animation worked, unfortunately. Oh, FYI, folks, animations, bad idea. But the first one is hypothesis testing, which is how do we make sure that things are happening the way that they're supposed to, and that we're not just confirming what we think we already know. The others that aren't going to show up, but if you would like a copy of this deck, please let me know, are my baby bias. So the fact that we love the things that we do, how do we make sure that we're still supporting them in what they need to be doing? And even if it means that their idea was wrong. Identity-based bias, I talked about this morning, but we're all subject to conscious and unconscious bias. How do you make sure to look for that in your own work? And finally, and only after you've established everything else, the tools. So these are things like great question, user testing, Sprig, but also the templates that you created. Get to those last once you're confident that they can run with this work. And then limits on what the outcomes can be. Now, what does this mean? Making sure that their extrapolation is limited to a reasonable scope within it. There's a difference between data and research. This is number 2. How do we make sure that they're not just collecting data and they are getting to an actual research stage? 3, some things are not UXR, right? If they are saying, well, I want to democratize research by chatting with every time the salesperson is on the call, I'm going to talk with someone. That's learning. It's not research, and that's okay, but setting that expectation on how those data can then be used. And finally, that they are democratizing research, not the researcher. There is a lot of opportunity still for researchers to thrive and grow. And there's a clear difference between a research project and the researcher themselves, and making sure that they know and understand those differences. Thank you for your patience with the lack of animations, everyone. Now, a leader finds the potential in people and processes and has the courage to develop that potential. This is your invitation. This is your hearkening call. to encourage that potential in your team and in your people who do research who are not researchers. Which brings us to a quick summary. This isn't an either or, it's an and. We are not fighting democratization and may the winner win everything. We are building an army together. Look for the and within your company. Your research team should come first. You might not yet be at the place of democratization, or democratization might have a very small piece of your organization for now. Great. Seeds have to start somewhere. Your tree will grow one day. Prioritize your team and their safety and security first. You need clear support, clear outcomes, and clear commitments. I suggest these 4, but consider with your team if they're the most appropriate for you, and the expectation of what it means to do this research well, what support you'll be giving, and what can come of it. And this only happens when it creates space for something better. Research democratization is not enabling more of exactly what we're doing now, but more than we could dream possible right now. And with that, I thank you.